Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. Welcome to Queen Mary and welcome to the Mile End Institute. My name is Robert Saunders. I am the Deputy Director of the Mile End Institute, and it's very good to see so many of you here. When the Mile End Institute was founded, one of the tasks that we were given was to look down the corridors of British politics. And what that meant was to try to put contemporary political controversies in some longer historical perspective. And that's what we're going to try and do this evening. It is 100 years ago this month since Margaret Thatcher was born. It will be 35 years next month since her resignation. And it is 12 and a half years since her death in 2013. And when I speak to some of our younger undergraduates who were born in 2007, I am very strongly reminded that this is very much a historical subject. But it's a period that continues to cast an extraordinary shadow over British politics, whether it is Keir Starmer removing Margaret Thatcher's portrait from number 10, or Kemi Badenoch declaring that Lady Thatcher's mission is my mission, or Liz Truss recreating images from the Thatcher story on her Instagram page. Margaret Thatcher seems to be very much alive in British politics long after her physical death. So what we'll be doing this evening is asking why and what the consequences of that might be. I should stress that the purpose of this event is neither to praise Margaret Thatcher nor to bury her. Rather, we want to think about why she exerts such a continuing hold on British politics, what her legacy might be, and what perhaps we've got wrong about this period. We'll be asking what survives of her legacy, what has been dismantled, whether Margaret Thatcher has become more myth than history, and whether that myth might have become destructive for the Conservative Party. And we have three excellently qualified speakers to help us do that. We will be starting this evening with Baroness Gillian Shephard. Lady Shephard came into Parliament in 1987. She worked with Margaret Thatcher as a minister and was subsequently a Secretary of State in John Major's government. In 2013, she published The Real Iron Lady on her experiences of working with Mrs. Thatcher. She's also an honorary fellow of Queen Mary, so it's particularly good to be able to welcome you back. We'll then be hearing from Baroness Simone Finn, who is also a Conservative peer who entered the House of Lords, I think, in 2015. Yes, good. She is a former Deputy Chief of Staff at Number 10, and she played a leading role in the organisation of Margaret Thatcher's funeral. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about that. In 2018, she ran to be the Conservative candidate to be Mayor of London, and she said, "We need a mayor who, like Margaret Thatcher, knows how to wield a handbag, but also to turn on the charm." And talking of charm, our third panellist is Philip Cowley, who is Professor of Politics here at Queen Mary, and he's also a former director of the Mile End Institute. He's the author and the editor of numerous books, including Sex, Lies and Politics, The Secret Influences That Drive Our Political Choices. And he co-wrote a fascinating article back in the year 2000 called Peasants' Revolt or Religious War, which was about Margaret Thatcher's election as leader of the Conservative Party in 1975. The format of the evening is that each of our speakers will make some introductory remarks. I'll then curate a bit of conversation between the panel, and we will then open it up to you to hear your questions. But can we begin, please, by welcoming our panel for this evening? So, over to you.
Well, good evening, everybody. Now, can you hear? Is this working? Yes. Fine. I'm going to make a confession straight away because Robert has suggested, or actually asked me, to include or indeed speak about personal memories of working in a Thatcher government. This was not an ageist comment, I don't think, but I do really feel almost like one of the last people standing. And so I am going to confine my remarks really to my personal contacts with her and what she was like to work with or work against or work alongside or in the slipstream of. I was elected as an MP in 1987, and by that time, Margaret Thatcher was at the top of her game. She'd won 3 general elections. She was the first female Prime Minister of this country. She became the longest-serving Prime Minister for in the last 150 years, and she aroused interest across the world, not least amongst women. I first met her in 1974 when she was Secretary of State for Education, and she visited my county of Norfolk. I was at that time the senior schools inspector, and it was my job to arrange her visits and drive her to them. So I had her for a whole extremely exhausting day. Now, on that day, she made an indelible impression. She was clearly indefatigable. She was going to survive an 18-hour day. She had extraordinary grasp of detail. She had a fiercely inquiring mind, enthusiasm for practical solutions, and tough, which she had needed to be merely to get elected as an MP. She had twice fought the strong Labour seat of Dartford, and then she applied to no fewer than 27 constituencies before she was adopted and subsequently elected in 1959 in the safe Conservative seat of Finchley. It wasn't like that when I put myself forward to be chosen as a woman Conservative candidate, but actually at my adoption meeting, 2 people got up and said, "We resign, we can't go back to Barroway Drove and tell them we're going to have a woman MP." It's so encouraging, but it was much worse for her. On the other hand, if you look at the context in which she rose to power, it wasn't in the least encouraging for ambitious women in many professions. There were only 28 women MPs in 1959 when she became an MP, of whom 11 were Conservative. There was just the one High Court woman judge, 2 permanent secretaries. Only 4% of college fellows at Oxford were women. Only 15 out of a total number of 53 on the council of the TUC were women, and 81% of all registered companies had no woman on their board. So it was pretty general. When she appointed me a minister in 1989, she said, "Dear." She also always called you dear because she never quite knew one's name. So microbe-like one was. "Dear," she said, "I'm bringing you into the government, but in the most junior post at Social Security. It's the post I started in, and the important thing is the detail." My heart sank, of course. But remember, women can do detail. Men can make speeches, but it is women who do things. She often said that kind of thing, and it was clearly a firm belief. What, to me, is really rather unfair is that she's still frequently criticised for not doing more for women, that's in quotes, particularly by the feminist movement. In fact, she did a great deal for women across the world by becoming Britain's first woman Prime Minister. Listen to Caitlin Morale, I don't think a paid-up Thatcherite, writing in 2012, who said, "Every time a woman in the public eye does something, she doesn't just do it for and as herself. She does it on behalf of 3.3 billion other women too. She is seen to represent her entire gender in a way that men just aren't." And that was certainly the case when Margaret Thatcher entered politics and then became PM. And it isn't much talked about, but she had to battle against the most extraordinary anti-women prejudice and outright snobbery from her own cabinet colleagues. The snobbery began in Oxford when Dame Janet Vaughan, the principal of Somerville, indeed has been quoted as saying, "I wouldn't dream of asking Margaret Roberts to one of our social weekends at Somerville. No, she really won't do." And I also, one of the most awful quotes I have ever heard, I was told by the son of one of Margaret Thatcher's male cabinet members, and because she had to sack him because he was useless. Afterwards, he said, "It was really like being sacked by your housemaid." Now, that says everything you need to say about what she was struggling against in the cabinet. She was also accused of not promoting other women because she didn't want competition in her own cabinet. The fact is that there was a very small pool of Conservative women MPs when she became leader, 12 in all, but despite that, she made Janet Young leader of the House of Lords. That caused a flurry at the time, I'm sure you can imagine. Linda Chalker became Deputy Foreign Secretary and Angela Rumboldt Minister of State. And she regularly met with women MPs of all parties. I have photographs to prove the case, just in case anybody doesn't believe me, as well as Conservatives. Regular meetings with representatives of the powerful Conservative Party Women's Organisation and with senior women politicians across the world. Another accusation is that she should have promoted more policies improving the lot of women. Well, I mean, apart from the fact that she was kept quite busy with issues like the Falklands War and Europe and the troubles in Ireland, not forgetting the assassination attack on her in 1984, fallout from the miners' strike, and domestic financial reform, apart from all of that, the accusation is simply not true. She was always concerned about policies which affected only women. She said to me, "Dear, just watch out for the Treasury over child benefit when it is budget time. The Treasury always try to reduce it, abolish it, or tax it. And that is wrong, because child benefit goes to the mothers, to the women, and they need it." Lo and behold, when I became a Treasury Minister, they tried again, and again we stopped them. She strongly felt that men who abandoned their wives and children should pay towards the keep of their children. And that resulted in the birth of the Child Support Agency, although it wasn't a wholehearted success. And I really have, I'm sure I'm going on too long, but I must tell you, when I was still at Social Security, there was a battle royal over increases in war widows' pensions. Now, this was being promoted heavily by the Evening Standard, which we knew she read. She didn't read the others. Bernard Ingham used to deal with that. In the Department of Social Security and at the Ministry of Defence, we had to oppose an increase in war widows' pensions because the Treasury, of course, refused to provide the funds. But in the end, it was discreetly suggested to the Treasury, and I wouldn't think my own Secretary of State would ever have had anything to do with this, but it was discreetly suggested to the Treasury that the Prime Minister might certainly take a strong interest in the matter, especially if Dame Vera Lynn got involved, or even worse, the Queen Mother. The Treasury gave in. Others are going to speak specifically on her policy legacy. In the early days of John Major's government, there was often the uneasy sense, it was appalling, that she was still in the room and listening, and of course disapproving. This was very unnerving, and I think he was unnerved, but of course she wasn't there. But this was particularly the case in the aftermath of the miners' strikes. In her day, there was scant understanding that mining communities were so closely intertwined with the industry that destroying it killed the communities too. And that, among other issues, had to be sorted by John Major's government, and it came to my bailiwick when I was, by then, in employment, I think it was. But her mark on this country and on many other parts of the world remains. And I want finally to share with you a very quick story, but it does involve you understanding the Norfolk accent. When I was canvassing for myself in 1987, I was asked to go and meet a very large group of female agricultural workers in Norfolk. They were very tough, they led hard lives and got low pay. And there was always one of them in charge. And I think the best way of describing this particular woman in charge was that she looked implacable. So I said to her, "What do you think of Mrs. Thatcher?" And she said, "Most of us are going to vote for Margaret Thatcher because she tells the men." You're allowed to laugh. She tells the men. She tells men what to do, they listen. These women were going to vote for her, and they were at the very bottom income level. That is the end.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, well, good evening. And I was asked by Rob to focus quite a few of my comments on on the preparation for Margaret Thatcher's funeral and my own personal sort of recollections. So it's not. So I'll try and do my best anyway. So Margaret Thatcher, you know, obviously a very Marmite character, sort of adored and abominated in equal measure. But she was the colossus of my teenage years. I was 11 years old when she became Prime Minister, and I grew up in Swansea. It wasn't fertile ground for a young Margaret Thatcher fan, but fan I was. And I remember canvassing for her in South Wales during the 1983 election, and someone was waiting behind a door to punch me. And I was a bit sort of taken aback by this, and I got back home to my mother, more left-wing mother, whose response was, "Well, it serves you right." So anyway, but for me, Margaret Thatcher represented aspiration, a sort of way out of my rather large and not particularly prepossessing comprehensive school. And years later, when I commiserated with Oliver Letwin, who'd been one of her early lieutenants, about losing the Conservative whip, he replied that I needn't worry about him, but he felt bad for another MP because, you know, he's a proper Conservative. And I said, "Well, Oliver, you know, you're a proper Conservative too." And he said, no, I'm not. I'm a Thatcherite, and so are you. And I've reflected on this quite a lot with her because a Conservative is wedded to tradition and cautious of change. And of course, Margaret Thatcher was the most radical Prime Minister of the past few generations. But equally, she was a Conservative, not a reactionary. And her clarity of vision, the wealth through private enterprise, lower taxes, tight control of government spending, giving people the chance to own their own homes, that was based on very clear Conservative principles. So anyway, roll forward to the coalition government in my life, where I worked as a special advisor in the Cabinet Office for the Minister Francis Maude. And part of his portfolio was True Blue, and this was the code name for the funeral plans for Baroness Thatcher. Now, the original name, I was told, was Operation Handbag, but that had been considered disrespectful. And Wikipedia says that it was Iron Bridge. But anyway, it was True Blue in my day. And so Margaret Thatcher, unlike other prime ministers, she wanted a large funeral. She didn't want a memorial service. And so the first question that we dealt with was whether this was going to be a state funeral, which was an honour that had previously been accorded to Winston Churchill. And I thought he was the only Prime Minister, but I've been corrected, and apparently Gladstone and Wellington had one too. So we had a lot of detailed advice from the civil servants about what constituted a state funeral. Not very much. It was a very grey, arcane area, vote in Parliament, whatever. But in the end, the family said, no, we don't want a state funeral, and the lady herself said she didn't want to be lying in state, and it wasn't appropriate. So it was deemed that it would be a ceremonial funeral with full military honours. And given that Her late Majesty the Queen had indicated and always said that she was going to attend the funeral, and it was only the second time she was going to attend the funeral of one of her prime ministers, the first being Winston Churchill, we sort of deemed, well, it's going to look like a state funeral to all intents and purposes. So anyway, so when Margaret Thatcher died in 2013, there were these 2 intense weeks of preparation. And Francis Maud chaired a COBRA meeting, which is, there's always the COBRA meeting when there's an emergency. And it's actually a really dank basement room in the Cabinet Office, and it stands for Cabinet Office Briefing Room A. So it's not as grand as it sounds, but every morning the police would congregate there, the military, the palace representatives, St. Paul's Cathedral representatives, the representatives from the city, from the Guildhall, they all came. Margaret Thatcher's executive was this rather marvellous chap called Sir Julian Seymour, and he and Sir Mark Worthington, her private secretary, were equally impressive. And I was suddenly in this world where, I was meeting all these people who, had been closest to Margaret Thatcher, and they were all sharing their stories and their memories. So her children, Mark and Carol, were there, fantastically appreciative and very, very respectful of the office of Prime Minister. Anyway, there's no time to repeat every detail. I've brought the funeral service that I dug out to try and remember the hymns, Love Divine or Love's Excelling, and I vow to thee my country, obviously. But in terms of a few triumphs and potential disasters, so there was a database with the guest list, and this was useless in full sort of Cabinet Office IT fashion, and kept crashing. So I kept getting these calls saying, I haven't been invited yet. And it was sort of, okay, right, fine. The Cabinet Office, the Honours Secretariat managed to lock, Lord Morris, Lord John Morris, Labour, in holy matrimony with the Baroness Morris, who was a Conservative. So they didn't get a lot of it right. They thought a Viscount was a biscuit, which is fine, but when you're the Honours Secretariat. So there were a few clangers. And the security, they were very worried about the security because obviously, as many people who were very upset about Margaret Thatcher's death, there had been many who loathed her, felt that there was a great lack of empathy with ordinary people, that she'd left a heartless legacy. But I did find the ding dong, the witch is dead, and that sort of rejoicing was sort of misogyny incarnate. Anyway, but the military, so the idea was that her coffin, which rested in St. Mary's Undercroft in the Palace of Westminster the night before the funeral, would go on its own sort of gun carriage to St. Paul's Cathedral. And the military very sensibly pointed out that if there were going to be a lot of protests on the way, this would be a very quiet and potentially sort of bad journey. So they said, we'll put behind a military band, which was actually a rather magnificent way to deal with it. In fact, there weren't any. There were a few protests on the day, but it was mostly very positive. And sort of we made certain that the military were in full force from St. Clement Danes to St. Paul's, which was a really magnificent spectacle. And the Bishop of London gave this rather fantastic eulogy where he recalled that, in the middle of it, quite a serious eulogy, when he said, she could be quite bossy. I remember her telling me, Bishop, don't touch the duck patty. It's very fattening. So anyway, but at the end of it, there was just this wonderful sort of loud cheer as I sat in St. Paul's thinking, please don't let anything go wrong. And it was the Queen Elizabeth II, the Duke of Edinburgh, went down the steps and stood with her family on the steps of St. Paul's, as they'd done at the 65 funeral of Winston Churchill. And you did think, well, it was a pretty good send-off. Anyway, a few recollections of myself. was that I only met Margaret Thatcher once. It was long after she stopped being Prime Minister. And she was at a party, and I was very touched and surprised by how warm she was, and seemingly quite genuinely pleased that I'd been an admirer. And I said to some of her ministers, gosh, isn't she lovely? It was sort of, and they assured me that she could be absolutely terrifying. But what really came through in the days of the funeral, when we were planning the funeral, was how very much her staff had adored her. Friends on the left who thought that Margaret Thatcher was the definition of heartlessness would be amazed to have discovered how incredibly kind and thoughtful she could be. And it was particularly with the junior staff, all the garden girls in number 10 sort of worshipped her, but also to ministers, constituents, colleagues. Staff told stories of going to her flat at night to have sort of her shepherd's pie that she insisted on heating up herself out of the freezer and putting peas into too small a pan or whatever. But I'd like to end with the insight that Norman Tebbit gave me. It was quite a clear insight, and he said, to understand how Margaret Thatcher approached policy, you had to understand three things about her. One, she was a scientist. Two, she was a nonconformist Christian. And three, she was the lower middle-class daughter of a grocer. And I've reflected on those points as we consider now her legacy. And they do explain the clarity on government spending and living within your means, the need for her evidence-based solutions, her caution, her pragmatism in implementation of her policies, the moral courage she had to be unpopular and to tell the truth, the way she connected, until the poll tax, with ordinary citizens. And Ian Dale described the right to buy scheme as literally the biggest shift of wealth to the working classes in history. And finally, as Gillian has so vividly described, those barriers she overcame, those incredible barriers, particularly in the male-dominated, patronising and snobbish Tory establishment. Thank you.
We've gone from someone who worked with Margaret Thatcher to someone who met Margaret Thatcher once to someone who never met Margaret Thatcher. But I did, as Rob said at the beginning, I did write a piece 20-something years ago now on the 1975 Conservative Leadership Contest. And there were two things about this, well, no, three. First was that it's one of the best things I think I've ever written, and it never gets cited, and it really annoys me. The second thing is that we did it in about 1999, 2000, and it involved writing to every member of the 1975 Conservative Parliamentary Party that was still alive. And they were, bluntly at that point, quite a few of them, getting on a bit. And during the process of writing to them, I mean, loads of them died. We'd get these letters that would say, I found your letter on my father's desk. And I'd think, oh dear, it was... And then I remember the guy I was writing the piece with came in and said, we've killed another one off.
Do you think I'm enjoying this?
But the third thing about this, and I was reminded of this because of something Simone said, as part of this, we went to the Conservative archive, the Thatcher archive at Churchill College. And there is there the handbag. It has its special own filing box. And of course, it's not a normal filing box, won't work for it. So they've built this lovely special filing box that you can look at some of the handbags in. I want to start actually on the 22nd of November, 1990, when I was an undergraduate. And I was sat at my desk working, writing an essay in the morning. And I was living in halls at the time. And I can't remember the details, but the cleaner was very unpopular. And there was a petition to get rid of the cleaner because she wasn't cleaning very well of that. And as I'm writing my essay, this guy sticks his head around the door, one of the guys who was most vociferous about the poor quality of this cleaner's cleaning, and said, she's gone. And then he disappeared. And I carried on with my essay. And I remember thinking, I hope the new cleaner's better. And then... And it's a sign, actually, it's a sign apart from anything else, it's a sign of how there was no rolling news, there was no internet, there was no phone, nothing, right? Until about an hour and a half later, someone else stuck their head around the door and said, what do you think the new Prime Minister? And at that point, I thought, maybe it's not the cleaner. If you then fast forward 35 years to now, earlier this year, as a much older, craggy man teaching undergraduates, I had an epiphany teaching my second years earlier this year, because we were teaching a class on the power of the Prime Minister. And I suddenly realized between the ages of 10 and 38, I experienced 3 Prime Ministers. Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair, and John Major. And people forget, John Major was there for 7 years, and won an amazing victory in 1992, completely overlooked and often forgotten, but a very long, by my current second years in the last decade have experienced 6 Prime Ministers. Yes. And if I can say this politely, maybe not all of those 6 have been top drawer. I'd also note in passing another difference. By the time she became Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher had been an MP for 20 years. She had plenty of experience at the front rank of British politics in the cabinet, the shadow cabinet, and junior ministerial office, as you said. We currently, and have now, this is not a point about the current government, this is a point about most recent governments, very inexperienced politicians being scrutinized by a very inexperienced parliament, which is presumably why things are going so well. I also realized doing this class, and Rob sort of alluded to this earlier, that Margaret Thatcher left office about 15 years before most of my students were born. She is to them what Churchill is to me, a historical figure about who I've read, but not to them someone they experienced in any way. Now, there's never any excuse for not knowing about things that happened in the past. You know about the dinosaurs and you know about the Romans and the Tudors. But there is a difference between knowing about something and having lived through it, I think. There is a sort of lived experience there, and that's currently lacking. I also think the Churchill example is important, not just because she is often seen as being a great political figure in the way that Winston Churchill is, but also that Churchill is another figure who now all the nuance and all the intricacy and all this, and bluntly, much of the interest has been stripped away from. And the Churchill that is often discussed in British political discourse is not the real Churchill. It's not the complicated Churchill who occasionally got things wrong and had flaws. It's a sort of mythical, sanctified figure. And I think a lot of the same thing has happened with Margaret Thatcher. The more you read about Churchill, I think the more interesting he becomes. I think the more you read about Margaret Thatcher, the more interesting she becomes. So if we go back again, sort of 35 years, to when I was a student working on this essay, during the Thatcher government, I vividly remember all the discussion at the time was about how people talked about, yes, oh sure, the Prime Minister was powerful, but the Thatcher effect, there was even a book I remember it was as an undergraduate reading it, the Thatcher effect wasn't anywhere near as dramatic as people either on the left or the right made out, because usually governments don't have that really dramatic effect. Policy making is difficult, government is tricky. And I think some of that's not quite true, but I do think that the last 35 years have stripped away all the nuance from the reality of the Thatcher governments. I won't go into great detail about this because I'm sure some of this will come up in Q&A, but for example, economic policy. Even economic policy, where there was quite dramatic shifts. There's a bit very early on in the Thatcher first term where she basically says, I would like to do more, but I can't. And I can't do more because Parliament won't stand for it. There's a constraint there that is often forgotten by people who think that this was sort of full speed ahead and damn the icebergs. Norman Tebbett's approach to trade union reform was actually very incremental and slow. You do it bit by bit, make each bit defensible. Over time, really quite dramatic. And obviously each stage resisted. Or privatization. I'm convinced if we did a sort of survey of knowledge about privatization, people would attribute to the Thatcher governments things that actually were privatized under the Major governments, which in many ways were much more radical on this. The first term Thatcher government is incredibly cautious. All of that has gone from the historical image. And I say this both left and right. Every time you write anything on Margaret Thatcher, particularly on social media, you just bombarded by people on the left for whom she is this hate figure. And then if you dare to say anything even vaguely critical, bombarded by people on the right for whom she's become this sort of love figure. One of my rules is that all the best political quotes don't really exist. And one of my favourites, which I'm sure wasn't ever really said, is from Lord Blake, who said that the two most important figures in British politics are both dead. And by that he meant Ramsay MacDonald for Labour and Robert Peel for the Conservatives. So on the left, the legacy of MacDonald was that all Labour MPs and Labour activists think that leadership are bastards and they're going to sell them out any day. And on the right, and John Major actually in his memoirs talks about feeling Peel over his shoulder, that on the Conservative Party you mustn't split the party. Now, Robert Blake may not have actually said this, but who cares about that? But I don't think it's true anymore. I think the most important figure, I don't know about the Labour Party, we can talk about that. The most important figure in the Conservative Party at the moment is dead, and it is Margaret Thatcher, because she has this, the legacy of Margaret Thatcher, and the way anything the current Conservative Party does is viewed through the prism of Margaret Thatcher, and often not really the real Margaret Thatcher, right, is a real problem for the party, and I think is a problem for the left. I'll end with just two small things, one of which is one of my favourite bits of polling, in which I'm going to mention both James Bond, Doctor Who, and Margaret Thatcher. It was a survey a few years ago which asked people about fictional TV characters and how they thought they would vote on Brexit. And you get this lovely effect where actually what you find is that for anybody who's not completely objectionable, people are just portraying their own characteristics onto the people. So Remainers, for example, thought James Bond would be a Remainer, and Leavers thought James Bond would be a Leaver. Remainers thought Doctor Who would be a Remainer, and Leavers thought, you get the picture. In 2019, the polling company repeated it for Margaret Thatcher. And Remainers thought she'd be a Remainer, and Leavers thought she'd be a Leaver. And when you probed a bit deeper and you looked at, okay, but did you like Margaret Thatcher? Did you approve of her? People who really approved of her, so these should be the people who really do want to pray and aid. The effect was even stronger. Almost all Leavers who really approved of Margaret Thatcher thought she'd be a Leaver, and vice versa for Remainers. Now, I personally would have challenged the premise of the question, because I would have said, well, hang on, do you mean Margaret Thatcher in government? Because I think she'd have been a Remainer. Or do you mean Margaret Thatcher after she left government? Because I think she'd have been a Leaver. But we'll come on to that maybe in questions. And the final point, I went to a book event that Ian Dale, the journalist Ian Dale, did once recently about his book on Margaret Thatcher. It's a good book, and the thing that's really interesting about it is he wrote it deliberately for an audience who don't know Margaret Thatcher. It's deliberately a sort of introductory, sort of beginner's guide to the subject. And at this book event in East Grinstead, Ian was asked a question. Now, Ian's too bright to fall into this trap, so Ian's a Leaver, but he thought she'd be a Remainer. And when he said this, there were gasps from this audience, as if this was heresy. But the bit I most liked was he was asked, one of the questions he gets asked most doing this book tour is, what would she do about immigration and small boats? And his answer was, I don't know. I don't know what she'd do. And he couldn't, I don't think he could hear it because he was at the front, but at the back they were muttering. But I thought it was a brilliant answer, and it was a brilliant answer because it was honest, and it was true. I don't think we do know what she would have done about immigration or small boats. And that maybe is the most interesting bit of all. Thank you.
Well, thank you to all three of you. I think since people are sharing their personal experiences of Margaret Thatcher, I should possibly share mine. I never met her. But when I was 7 years old, I invented a machine that would fly across the world sucking up nuclear weapons. And for some reason, I decided to send the blueprints to the world's most pro-nuclear weapon politician, showing a catastrophic political judgment that has never deserted me since. But then, when Margaret Thatcher died in 2013, I did a lot of interviews for the international press, not for the British press, but for journalists overseas. And it was absolutely fascinating, because for about 3 days, I just had one conversation after another, all of which were about completely different things. So South African journalists wanted to talk about apartheid. Latin American journalists wanted to talk about General Pinochet and the Falklands War. Russian journalists wanted to talk about Gorbachev. German journalists wanted to talk about her disastrous response to German reunification and the fall of the Berlin Wall. American stations wanted to talk about her relationship with Ronald Reagan. Indian stations wanted to talk about Indira Gandhi. And what this really brought home was that there are lots of different Thatchers that have different legacies and different impacts on the modern world. And I think, as Phil was saying, the attempt to crunch them together into one unchanging, undeviating Thatcher is a real problem. So I'd like to begin actually by asking you, Lady Shephard, what do you think that we get most wrong about Margaret Thatcher? And what don't we talk about in relation to her time in power that perhaps we should?
I think people think that she made up her mind before an argument, but that is totally untrue. She loved argument, she loved debate. She was able to be persuaded by a good argument in favour of something that she had not thought she agreed with. In other words, there was a very fair-minded aspect of her in practice, and that happened in cabinet or even in committee procedures, where the public didn't see it. I think she felt, I don't know that I'm right here, I think she was very conscious of being a woman in a position that no woman had held before in this country. And I think, therefore, that she felt she had to listen to all arguments to make up her own mind and either confirm or not confirm what her instincts were. People will not believe how carefully she listened, but she did. And I don't think anyone knows that. Nobody, Ian Dale may have written it into his book, I don't know. It was certainly, even at my very junior level, something that I found. But what she actually liked also was the argument. She loved an argument.
Do you think that declined at all over time as she became more self-confident and perhaps more caught up in her own myth?
I think maybe so. I mean, people do, as they age, they become more convinced of their own invincibility. There's no question about that. And also, of course, when you think about it, she'd been round all the arguments about almost everything a very great number of times. I think as a woman also she felt that she needed to be extremely emphatic, which many people translated as strident, which is interesting really because that's what she called the feminist movement, and I've never understood her antipathy towards the feminist movement. Actually, it was what she tried to do for women in practice as well. So that's a rambling answer.
That's very interesting.
But I just want people to go away with the realisation that she didn't arrive in rooms with her mind made up always.
Okay, thank you. Phil, you've in a sense already touched on that question of what is it that we get wrong about Margaret Thatcher. So perhaps a slightly different question for you. I remember Ian Dunt wrote a piece a few years ago in which he said that Margaret Thatcher was no longer a historical figure. She has become a religious figure. He was talking particularly about her standing in the Conservative Party. And we saw recently at the Conservative Party conference a selection of her outfits almost presented as sort of sacred relics. And I wondered, do you think that the myth of Margaret Thatcher has become a problem for the Conservative Party today?
So I'm actually going to start by answering the first question, but to say that I think the thing that I got wrong about Margaret, I mean, I do think when I was younger, and I think this I've realised more and more with time, the more I've read about her and the more I've encountered documents and interviews, I think that sense to which she was patronised, I mean, both of you mentioned it in past, by sort of the grandees of the Conservative Party.
Yeah.
Very wealthy establishment figures who looked down, all privately educated, who looked down their nose at her. I think I both underestimate, as a child growing up in the Thatcher years, I think I underestimated that. And I think we collectively occasionally underestimate the extent to which that must have, you can't show weakness. You can't, there was none of that effortless superiority that comes with having privilege and wealth baked in. Now, it's equally, she wasn't some horny-handed son of toil who'd worked down the mines. I mean, I think sometimes that bit of the myth is also exaggerated. But the extent to which she was looked down upon by establishment figures in the Conservative Party really created the Thatcher that we then encounter. And so sometimes we see it, or saw it, as uncaring or unbending, but I think it was forged out of that encounter. Do I think it's a problem? Yes, I do think it's a problem. I think it's a problem. I mean, I think that the Truss administration was itself an example of it. The myth was, as I say, full speed ahead, damn the icebergs, Margaret would have done this. But that was not how the Margaret Thatcher government proceeded. It proceeded slowly and cautiously. It picked its fights, even with the miners. You know, initially, knowing that they couldn't win a fight, they retreated, and then they moved forward when they thought they could win the fight. And I think that bit of the myth, that conviction just consists of charging forward, not listening, I think is really damaging for the Conservative Party. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm tempted to put the same question to Lady Finn about whether this has become a problem for the Conservative Party. But I wonder if I could also ask you about your time working for Boris Johnson. Because there was a sense, I think there was a lot of newspaper coverage at the time that suggested actually that the Conservative Party was entering a post-Thatcher moment with Boris Johnson, that he talked about himself as a Brexity Hezza, and that's an interesting choice in terms of Michael Heseltine. He's not morally conservative or socially conservative in the way that Margaret Thatcher is. He seems to be quite comfortable with higher levels of public expenditure that she might not like. He talked about levelling up left-behind communities. Do you think there was a sort of post-Thatcher moment under Boris Johnson? And if there was, what happened to it?
That's interesting. I mean, I was reflecting on the previous discussion, totally agree on the caution and pragmatism that Margaret Thatcher showed, which really didn't come out, and she did consider her moves carefully, and everyone tells, from her former Treasury Permanent Secretary to ministers who've worked for her, that she not only enjoyed the arguments, but she tested them with them. She wanted to see people. She could be intimidating, and she wanted to see that they could fight back, that they were in charge of their briefs and their and knew their facts. I mean, I was at Manchester and I saw the raincoat that she was in the tank wearing, and the maroon suit that she wore when she made her resignation statement. And I'd have to say, I thought it was a bit spooky. I mean, I didn't love it, and I think that the Conservative Party has fixated on her in a way that's not particularly healthy. I mean, she herself was always talking about you look forward, you don't look back, that you plough on. I mean, I think we could do with a few of her, the fact that she had a narrative and that she did it from classic Conservative principles was a huge advantage, and you could see that Kemi Badenoch was emulating that she was trying to formulate a Conservative narrative at the conference. And I think to a similar extent, there was a Boris narrative. He probably was more of a Heseltine than a Margaret Thatcher. He's more socially conservative than people think. And in fact, I think Margaret Thatcher was less socially conservative than people imagine. You know, she voted to decriminalise homosexuality and was one of the very few Conservatives who did so. And she worked with a lot of gay men, and she didn't. According to sources, she wasn't that sort of damning about those who had affairs or whatever. So she wasn't, I don't think she was quite as moralistic as she's made out to be. I think she had her own moral convictions. Now, I'm not going to pretend that Boris was, had morals coming out of every pore, but he did have a profound sense when he was elected with a large majority that it was a responsibility. And the levelling up agenda was very much one that he wanted to do, and he really, really wanted to make Brexit work. He felt that he'd fought for this and that he believed in it, and had really come more so to believe in it, and that he wanted that vision to come out. So no, it wasn't a Thatcherite vision necessarily, but it was based on conservative principles, more of a Heseltine. And I think a lot of the tragedy was that COVID came along and got in the way, and we forget how much COVID wrecked the public finances.
We're out of time for this stage of the evening, but fortunately the conversation can continue outside where drinks are waiting. Please do join us, keep the discussion going. If you're not on our mailing list, please do sign up. I think hopefully there's a QR code on the screen, or there will be at some point soon. Our next event is going to be a webinar following up from our recent Hennessy lecture on the security situation in Europe and the implications of supporting Ukraine. We have all sorts of other interesting events coming up, but can we please end this stage of the evening by thanking Gillian Shephard, Philip Cowley and Simone Finn.